Hello, everyone, and good evening and welcome to the 47th round of the Cairo Climate Talks, Biodiversity in a Changing Climate. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Biodiversity is an indicator of a healthy ecosystem, vital for sustaining human life. In the last few decades, however, rapid population increase, expansion of industry, rampant air and water pollution, overexploitation of plant and animal resources, the use of technologies that damage the environment, and climate change have led to a global, unprecedented loss in biodiversity and ecosystem degradation. A recent WWF study has shown current extinction rates are estimated to be between 1,000 and 10,000 times higher than the natural extinction rate. Optimistic studies claim an annual species loss between 0.01 and 0.1%, translating to 200 to 2,000 species becoming extinct every year. Since all living organisms are part of an integrated and interdependent web, and each species has its own role, a malfunction or loss of any part of the ecosystem can cause an imbalance that affects all other parts. Reduced biodiversity is both strongly affected by humans and strongly affects our well-being. If we continue on this path, it's predicted that we will experience severe food, water, and energy shortages. Egypt, with almost 92% desert and 8% arable land, is a circumscribed environment with distinct ecological areas, including the Mediterranean, the Sinai, the Eastern Desert, the Western Desert, and the Nile Valley, as well as the Delta. Egypt is home to extremely varied species, around 2,075 species of plants, 470 species of birds, 93 species of mammals, 1,700 aquatic species, 106 reptiles and amphibians, as well as countless numbers of insect species. Several of these are endemic, meaning they are only found in Egypt. Human behavior is increasingly threatening biodiversity in Egypt. Most notably, pollution and habitat destruction due to development are drastically altering Egypt's ecosystem. The limited public awareness of wildlife conservation and biodiversity further leads to reduced civil society engagement with such a vital issue. Egypt's abundance of species is likely to decline in the coming years if biodiversity and ecosystem management is not integrated into development planning and industrial activities. In response to these concerns, numerous states have negotiated the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, in order to conserve biodiversity, ensure fair and equitable sharing of its benefits, and promote biodiversity as a cornerstone towards achieving sustainable development. The 14th Conference of Parties to the Biodiversity Convention, or COP14, will meet in Egypt in late 2018. The COP will be held for the first time in Egypt, making it a great opportunity to raise awareness about biodiversity within the region, thus contributing to the fulfillment of the CBD's objectives. So before turning to our panelists, I would like to call His Excellency Julius Gorgloy, the Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany, to the stage to give his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christiana Pascha-Palmer, Assistant Secretary General and Executive Secretary of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, Dr. Yasmin Fuad, Assistant Minister of Environment, representatives of ministries and embassies, colleagues, German and Egyptian panelists, I think they are mainly in this corner, ladies and gentlemen, and as always, last but not least, dear Cairo Climate Talkers. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 47th Cairo Climate Talks panel discussion today. The CCT, as it has gained its name, as a series of monthly events, were initiated in 2011 by the German Embassy in close cooperation with the Egyptian Ministry of Environment, as well as the German Society for International Cooperation and the German Academic Exchange Service. Their aim is to provide a platform to exchange experiences, raise awareness, and foster cooperation between policymakers, business, the scientific community, and civil society. During my now 1.5 years in Cairo, I have witnessed many interesting discussions being raised here in the CCT. Whether this was about energy efficiency, ecopreneurship, climate finance, water management, wastewater management, sustainable agriculture, or biomass. And I have always been, as I'm tonight, delighted to see what an interested, knowledgeable, and civically very committed audience we continue to have. Biodiversity, tonight's topic, again promises an exciting discussion in many respects. On the one hand, we were able to win a highly competent keynote speaker, Dr. Pasha Palmer, our guest of honor. Thank you for being with us. On the other hand, the topic could not be more up to date. The preparations, as mentioned already, for the 14th Conference of the Parties to the Biodiversity Convention, which will take place in Egypt next year, Sharm el-Sheikh, and the preparations just began. This is a great opportunity for Egypt and an excellent time to shed light on challenges and accomplishments regarding the conservation of biodiversity in this country and worldwide. In the face of everyday life's challenges, in the face of poverty, hunger, and conflict in many regions of the world, topics such as the protection of natural habitats and species might seem of secondary importance at best. It is only when nature falls out of balance that we realize how much our existence relies on it. Nature provides us with food, drinking water, medicines, fertile soils, and fuels. Our ability to withstand climate change and natural disasters is also largely dependent on healthy, functioning ecosystems, which bases its systemic stability on strong biodiversity. Biodiversity provides us and future generations with spaces and opportunities for economic, social, and cultural development. Paradoxically, as one of the main benefactors of biodiversity are either directly or indirectly the main cause of its decline. For many years already, we humans put our own livelihood and those of our children at risk with our unrelenting and seemingly unelectable strive for technological progress and economic growth. At some point, we even perceived the protection of natural habitats and species as an obstacle for development. Costs for restoring damaged ecosystems are 10 times higher than for nature conservation, according to a study conducted by the United Nations Environment Programme in 2010. This, of course, only if the damage is still reversible. Germany regards the Convention on Biodiversity as a key framework for human efforts aimed at conserving the natural foundations of life. My country has been firmly committed to global biodiversity conservation for many years and is one of the largest contributors in this field. Since 2013, we have provided more than €500 million annually for the conservation of forests and other ecosystems in more than 70 countries. Our Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development and our Federal Ministry for the Environment are working together to bring this about. Our Federal Ministry of Research explores scientifically assured options for the protection of biodiversity and ecosystems worldwide in a joint effort of various research disciplines and in close cooperation with different interest groups. Further projects are being carried out by our federal ministries for agriculture and, to my own surprise, for defense as well. Ladies and gentlemen, despite many national and international countermeasures that have already been taken, biodiversity is still dwindling dramatically worldwide. More can and should be done on the individual, the societal, the economic, and the political level. But how? What we need is first of all a more holistic view of progress, including a sophisticated understanding of nature and its inner mechanisms and interdependencies. However, the perennial question remains how economic, social, and ecological reasons can be combined and translated into practical concepts. I will leave this big wheel to be turned by our panelists, and of course by you, Dr. Pascal Palmer, our keynote speaker tonight. Wish all of us an interesting evening and a fruitful debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your opening remarks. And now please welcome me in inviting Dr. Yasmine Fouad, the Assistant Minister of Environment, for her opening statement. Thank you.
مساء الخير. برحب بحضراتكم وبشكر السفارة الألماني على عقد هذه الندوة. I'll shift into English. Good afternoon. Good evening, actually. Your Excellency, Ambassador Julius George, Ambassador of Federal Republic of Germany in Cairo. Your Excellency, Dr. Christiana Palmer, UN Assistant Secretary General and Executive Secretary of UNCBD. Welcome in Egypt. Dear panelists, audience, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express at the outset the apology of His Excellency, Dr. Khaled Fahmy, Minister of Environment, for not being able to join us today, although he's very keen to be one of the Cairo climate talkers throughout the previous process, but he had to travel to Geneva to attend the high-level segment of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conference of Parties. I would like really to set the stage for the panelists, not to give a real speech, but rather to draw some important lines that maybe would be important to raise during our 1.5 hours of discussion. At the global level, we had the UNCBD convention in the early 90s, but we need always to remember that it was not the UNCBD alone. It was the UNCBD, the UNFCCC, which is climate change, and the UNCCD, that is land degradation. The three of them meant to be the overarching framework for sustainable development. Throughout the process, from 1992 till now, we cannot underestimate that the three connected conventions were meant to be connected in order to help countries and help the international community to achieve sustainable development. And when we come to see, after the Millennium Development Goals and after the SDGs that have been adopted in 2015, the huge linkage is always there. In the local Agenda 21 in the early 90s, in the Millennium Development Goals under Goal 7 of the ensuring environmental sustainability, under the current Sustainable Development Goals, you will find Goal 13 on climate change, 14 related to the oceans and the sea, and 15 related to the ecosystem, biodiversity, and land degradation. So they were always at the global level meant to be connected in order to give the floor and the environment for different practitioners to think of how can we really implement those theories to be practically on the ground. And those were meant not only to push sustainable development, but to be tools in order to eradicate poverty and find a way of enhancing the quality of life of the people, as well as sustaining the livelihood approaches. At the regional level, let me give a very solid example of how the CBD and the CCT climate change were actually very similar in nature, and it's really a very funny thing. When you talk about the Paris Agreement, we find that the African group of negotiators were connected. They were unified. They were speaking with one voice as related to the position of what do we need to see in the Paris Agreement. Similarly, in the Conference of Parties in Mexico, it was the African also group of negotiators related to the biodiversity that did speak with one voice. They did make sure and wanted to make sure that the Conference of Party 14 will be on an African soil. It will be an African COP, as they have mentioned that, and they wanted to make sure that this would happen. They transferred the decision that came out from the African Ministerial Conference on Environment that was held in April 2016 in Cairo into a real action, supporting Egypt as representing Africa in order to host the COP14. When I come to talk about our national level, where does Egypt stand? Does Egypt realize those global commitments? Does Egypt realize the regional support that is there? Yes, it does. When you're talking about the very early beginning in the 1990s and how the country had started to push further the sustainable development issues, in the early 2000s, the country also tried to connect the three convention by a very small exercise of the national capacity self-assessment, where we were trying to assess ourselves, our capacities to connect the three convention together. And I would like to say that public participation was one of the constraints that came out of that exercise. It's not only for Egypt, it's for all the developing country. Public participation came as one of the constraints that hindered pushing the three conventions together and achieving the sustainable development. After 10 or 12 years of that, Egypt came up with the Sustainable Development Strategy, which is Egypt Vision 2030. If we look at the strategy, that we will find that under the environment pillar, the strategic objective 2 and the strategic objective 4, both are related to the biodiversity and the convention. One, strategic objective 2 relates to the ecosystem approach and ecosystem balance, and under the strategic objective 4, we had the fulfillment of our obligations under the multilateral environmental agreements and ensuring its alignment and consistency with the national policies and plans. What does this mean? This simply means that we realize that the core of sustainable development is the three conventions. We realize that there are global commitments that we have to fulfill, and we realize that there is a gap, that we will need to bridge this gap in order to link up those global commitments within the national policies and plans, which my colleague earlier here has mentioned, the mainstreaming of the biodiversity. When I come to think, how can we achieve biodiversity and the ecosystem balance in such a changing climate within the various and the very huge impact of climate change? I think there are opportunities. Let us think of topics that are related to food security, sustainable land management, protection of coral reefs, promotion of sustainable tourism. For every single one of those topics, the three conventions are connected, the three areas. And that's the key to success. The key is to think within a holistic and integrated approach where every and single stakeholder has a stack, has a role to play. And they are still all related to the sustainable livelihood approach and the sustainable of the communities, of the people that we were serving. It's true that I mentioned that the public participation is limited, but still there is a room. There is a room when the non-governmental organization would come and lift up the hands of the local community and try to integrate their voices, their needs, and their perspective into the projects that relate to the natural resources conservation. There is a room for the youth at the level of the universities in order to promote for issues related to the biodiversity and the linkages of the global environmental commitments. There is a room for the private sector where they can conduct business packages in order to see how much the biodiversity is not only sustaining the livelihood approach, but also providing a kind of an income and providing a kind of a push to the sustainable economic growth of the country. The government would have to work on regulatory framework and enabling environment for all those stakeholders to really work and work practically on the ground. We invite you and we invite all our development partners not only to exchange the views, the case studies, the best practices, and the lessons learned, which we are in a very real need of, but we are inviting everyone to start participating in the preparation for the CBD COP14 to make sure that we are working on a very clear, definite roadmap, something that is realistic. It's not theories, it's not strategies, but something that will help our people all over the world to sustain their livelihood. And this CCT is just a start for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fouad, for your remarks. Now, please joining me in welcoming Dr. Christiana Pashka-Palmer, the United Nations Assistant Secretary General and the Executive Secretary of the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity. It's a special honor to have Dr. Pashka-Palmer joining us at the CCT today. She is in Egypt on a preparatory visit for the upcoming CBD COP14 in Sharm el-Sheikh in 2018. So please welcome her.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. Your Excellency, Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany, Your Excellency, Dr. Fouad, Assistant Minister for Environment, Your Excellency, Dr. Hamdallah Zedan, the Egypt coordinator of the UN Biodiversity Conference in 2018, as referred here as CBD, but for those of you who may not know the acronym. Distinguished audience and ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to address you at this session of the Cairo Climate Talks in this beautiful and historic city. Indeed, it is my first time to Egypt, and since I was a little girl, I was dreaming to come to this beautiful country. So here I am finally, many years later, but I made it. I want to extend my sincere appreciation to the German Embassy in Cairo, the Ministry of Environment of Egypt, the German Society for International Cooperation, and to the German Academic Exchange Service for inviting me to address you this evening. Indeed, I believe these talks represent the kind of in-depth discussions and exchange of experiences that are needed to face the challenges and find solutions to the difficult problems that we are facing today in the environmental realm, and not only. You may be wondering why I, as the new Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, have been invited to speak about climate change. Well, we heard earlier from two very, very good speakers about the linkages between these two agendas. And there are indeed very strong linkages for these two critical challenges that we are facing as humanity, and that may not be so obvious to the general public and decision makers, and sometimes not even to those who are involved in defining and shaping these agendas, because they are approached in silos. Before becoming the Executive Secretary of CBD, I was the Minister of Environment, Waters and Forest in Romania. And I've seen, as a politician and as somebody who has worked in this field for many years, indeed that the biodiversity agenda sometimes is not receiving enough political attention for us to find the best solutions and link it, a topic that is perceived as very scientific, but in fact, it is about life. It is about sustaining our life on this planet, and it is about development. And I think Dr. Fouad very nicely touched on those linkages. So the truth is that we are used to break big problems in smaller pieces so we can address them, but we address them sometimes separately in silos. And there is nothing wrong with that in certain domains. But certainly when we deal with nature and natural systems, such approaches are not very effective. Because in reality, natural systems do not operate in silos. Nature doesn't differentiate between climate change or biodiversity or ecosystem. It's one complex system of planetary life. What I want to say is that biodiversity and climate change are, as international political agendas, in a way artificially separated and treated by us as separate regimes. But Dr. Fouad very nicely explained that this convention, the Biodiversity Convention, together with climate change and the Desertification Convention, they emerged in 1992 from the Rio summit, and they are all three sisters conventions. It's true that nowadays climate change is capturing very much the international attention and the resources, but let us not forget again that they are all interconnected. So there is a lot of work to be done there to bring biodiversity again to the center of attention. So in my address to you today, I would like to focus on these linkages between biodiversity and climate change and emphasize that only if we approach these two global public challenges from a holistic systems perspective could we identify solutions that are viable and sustainable in the long run. Tonight I will speak about three issues. Firstly, I will briefly discuss the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. Secondly, I will highlight how we can reduce the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. And thirdly, I will discuss the role that biodiversity can play in responding to climate challenges. So let me start with the first impact. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment named climate change as one of the 5 global drivers of biodiversity loss, and the 5th report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tell us that the impacts of climate change are felt by the most natural systems. Climate change will negatively impact biodiversity through increased extreme weather events, warming ocean temperatures, changing precipitations and melting snow caps, as well as changes in air temperature and seasonal patterns. These changes in turn will lead to drastic changes in biodiversity, such as higher instances of wildfires, coral bleaching, sea level rise, changes in species distribution, and changes in the timing of life cycle events for many species. And Egypt, unfortunately, is not immune to these impacts. It is especially vulnerable to sea level rise, which results in loss of territory, such as the sinking of the Rosetta apex, coastal erosion and saltwater intrusion into underground reservoirs. Sea level rise could result in significantly reduced fertility in the Nile Delta, and I know that I don't have to emphasize how serious that would be for Egypt. But why should what happens in the natural world matter to us? Well, all these changes seem removed sometimes from the everyday life of ordinary people, ordinary Egyptians. Well, I think it's important because we as humans are an intrinsic part of the natural world, and because we rely so greatly on the natural world, directly and indirectly. We need to be ready to take action to reduce potential impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems. For example, coral bleaching and coastal erosion could result in dramatic economic changes in Egypt's coastal regions. Firstly, they could result in a reduction in revenues from marine-based tourism. Coral reefs are an important attraction in nature-based tourism, ecotourism, and contribute a significant portion of Egypt's tourism dollars. Secondly, many coastal Egyptian communities rely on these coastal habitats for food and for shoreline protection. And there's a very relevant study, the study on economics of ecosystems and biodiversity report informed us a few years ago. Biodiversity and ecosystem services supports are very much part of the GDP and the GDP of the poor. At this point, you may all be getting quite depressed, but I would say, well, let's not get depressed. Let's acknowledge the reality and move to action. While climate change will have major impacts on biodiversity, and there is no doubt about that, there is much we can do to reduce these impacts or their magnitudes. The global community has already agreed on what needs to be done, whether it is in decisions under the UN Biodiversity Convention, which, by the way, has 196 states as members. So 196 states of this world are part of the Biodiversity Convention. That's almost the entire world. We are all there together, and we committed to this agenda. We have the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity Conservation, which is a global plan with very ambitious targets called Aichi targets, a bit of a technical name, between 2010 and 2020. So we are 3 years away from the end of these strategic targets, and the time will come for us to draw the line and see if we met the ambitious targets, if we managed really to preserve biodiversity and to halt the disappearance of species. And then we have the Paris Climate Agreement, one of the greatest successes in international negotiations for environment. We have the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. We have, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, which now provide us the overarching framework until 2030 to try to bring and integrate and indeed find the synergies between all these agendas to come together. Let me now turn to the second point I want to discuss, and this is how we can lend a helping hand to nature to allow her to adapt to climate change and also to allow us to adapt to climate change. You have heard the term resilience a lot these days. It's very popular, just like sustainable development. For example, we talk about building infrastructure that is climate resilient, about helping communities to be more resilient to the effects of climate change. Resilience is, in fact, a term that originates in complex system science and systems ecology. And in the context of climate change, it means the ability of an ecosystem to bounce back from external shocks caused by climate-relevant events. We can help biodiversity and ecosystems to be more resilient and adapt to climate challenges by reducing other human-related impacts on biodiversity. We have to halt ecosystems destruction and degradation. We have to eliminate pollution, not harder to do than to say. We have to eradicate invasive alien species and sustainably utilize components of biodiversity. In addition, we need to invest in ecosystems conservation and restoration. Furthermore, we can help nature to adapt by continuously assessing which groups and ecosystems are vulnerable to climate change and what threats climate change poses to them. We must also monitor actual impacts of climate change on biodiversity. And Egypt is well placed in this regard because it has, within its national biodiversity strategy and action plan, identified a strategic goal to prepare for climate change and combat desertification, and a related target, which goes that by 2020, it will investigate and monitor all the effects of climate change on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Moreover, we help nature to adapt by ensuring that whatever actions we take to mitigate and adapt to climate change does not have a negative impact on biodiversity. For example, biofuel expansion has the potential for large-scale habitat destruction. It's been discussed quite a bit, biofuel as a source of alternative energy. But we have to, again, look at it in a holistic approach, because while it may help the renewable energy agenda, it will seriously damage the biodiversity and, for that matter, the food security agenda. So we have to be careful with that. If implemented correctly, environmental impact assessments and strategic environmental assessments are great tools to ensure that impacts on biodiversity are minimized. I know that in its national determined contribution, the commitment that the countries had to put forth in advance of the Paris Agreement for climate change, Egypt has the aim to proactively protect coastal zones. I would like, therefore, to urge caution in your approach, as some coastal zone protection schemes, such as seawalls, actually could have a negative impact on biodiversity. This brings me to the final point, and I wish to discuss this evening, which is the role that nature plays in responding to climate change, or what we say, in other words, nature-based solutions. And this is my favorite one. The Biodiversity Convention published a report last year that highlights that terrestrial and coastal ecosystems store more than 5 times as much carbon as the atmosphere. So think about that. Whilst land cover, change, and ecosystem degradation are responsible for about 10% of the total yearly anthropogenic carbon emissions. So when we protect biodiversity, when we protect forests, we in the same time contribute to reducing the impacts of climate change. Therefore, sustainable management of ecosystems can lead to global and national mitigation goals through advanced, though avoided emissions and increased carbon sequestration. So this is the mitigation aspect of climate change. On the adaptation aspect of climate change, ecosystem-based climate adaptation, or EBA, since we are in a world of acronyms for short, is a tool that can be used to maintain and increase the resilience and reduce the vulnerability of ecosystems and people to the impacts of climate change. When correctly implemented, EBA provides an affordable means to adapt to the impact of climate change. And for example, Egypt intends to protect the genetic diversity of livestock and crop species. And this is an excellent example of using biodiversity to adapt to climate change. So now we are in a critical period, I would say, because we are in the final years coming to the end of the Global Strategic Plan for Biodiversity, 2020, right? And we need to look at how much we were able to implement of this ambitious agenda that these 196 countries committed to, and in the same time reflect to what are we going to do post-2020 for this agenda, because despite all our efforts, what we are seeing in reality is that we continue to lose species and we continue to not see the important connection between biodiversity, between all the species on this planet and supporting our life here. And that link has to be better explained to people, better explained to politicians, so that we can also direct resources in that part. I mentioned implementation of actions to address climate change, therefore have to be enhanced and scale up. I think of our early estimates is that we will not probably reach all the ambitious targets that we had, these Aichi targets. So a lot more has to be done in these remaining years to accelerate that agenda. And we need a stronger sense of urgency, because the loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species, and the loss of ecosystem services are either impossible or very difficult to replace. Once we lose them, they are gone. It's very, very hard to reintroduce species or an ecosystem that is completely destroyed to make it work again. And as the ambassador very rightly pointed out, a healthy ecosystem is what we need to be able to have also a fruitful life here, not just for us, but for all the other species that share this beautiful planet with us. So without maintaining biodiversity and ecosystems that have the ability to absorb the shocks of climate change, we will indeed not be able to adapt to climate change, and we will not survive and thrive here. So as we look to the 2018 and the fact that Egypt will host this wonderful conference, and I have all the high hopes. I came here very early in my mandate. I assumed my job just a month and a half ago. And I came because I wanted to already meet my counterparts and the Egyptian authorities to kickstart what I hope to be a very, very successful conference, where we will discuss in an open fashion all these issues, but also, again, look at solutions and look at how we can implement really on the ground. Because we have all the strategies we need. We have all the thinking there. We have the science there. We need the political will, and we need the resources to make it happen at the national level, at the local level, because we are all together in this. And like I said, nature doesn't know boundaries. So I am confident that under the stewardship of Egypt and with the support of the Secretariat of the Biodiversity Convention and all the critical partners, we will make the important strides needed to better integrate the climate change with the biodiversity, the desertification, indeed all these agendas together, and work on the synergies between them. And I wanted to leave you with a final thought, and in fact final impressions, because today I was generously taken by the Egyptian colleagues to visit the desert part, to visit Wadi al-Hitan, and I was truly impressed, very, very impressed, first by the beauty of nature there, but also the message that that place gives to all of us, all those species that have disappeared many years ago, also as a result of climate change and climate shocks, and the museum that I think it's worth for everybody to see and to learn from it, because we still have perhaps some time to mitigate these shocks, but not so much time. So urgent action and urgent commitment at individual level, but also aggregately at local and national and global level is much needed. So thank you very much, and I look forward to my next trip to Egypt, maybe on, Cairo Biodiversity Talks. And I look forward to working with all of you to prepare a very good convention and bring 196 parties here to address this agenda. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Your Excellency, for joining us and for your keynote address. Before I call the panelists onto the stage, I'd like to remind you of how this works. You'll have a small yellow Post-it note, and you can write a question on that note. And after we start our discussion, maybe 20 minutes afterwards, I'll have some of our colleagues here come around and pick up the questions, and I will be able to ask some of your questions to our panelists. So I'll remind you in about 15, 20 minutes to quickly write down your questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelist. Our first panelist is Dr. Hamdallah Zidane. He holds a bachelor's in science and a master's in science from Cairo University. His PhD is from Montreal University. He is a professor of microbiology and immunology from Faculty of Pharmacy in Cairo University. Among many things, he's the former chairman and current secretary of the Pharmaceutical Society's Committee Sector, Supreme Council of Universities. From 2007 to 2013, he was the chairman of the Egyptian Company for Sera Vaccines and Drugs. He held various positions in the United Nations from 1984 to 2005, including the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and the Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity from 1998 to 2005. And he's the director of the UN EP Biodiversity, Genetic Resource, and Biotechnology Program from 1984 to 1997. So please welcome him to the stage. All right, our second panelist is Dr. Lisa Bieber-Fraudenberger. She's the senior researcher at the Center for Development Research at the University of Bonn. Her research focuses on the connection between human development and biodiversity conservation. She has a strong publication record in peer-reviewed journals in the area of biodiversity, conservation, climate change, and human development. Dr. Bieber-Fraudenberger has worked on numerous projects involving climate change and biodiversity issues in different countries, including several in West Africa, as well as Kenya. Please welcome her. Our third panelist is Noor Noor. He's an environmentalist working in the field of biodiversity conservation and environmental education. Noor manages the Nature Conservation Egypt. It's an NGO focusing on bridging conservation with economic development through promoting nature-friendly energy, responsible tourism, and hunting management. Please welcome Noor. And last but not least, we have Dr. Hania El Atribi. She was recently appointed consultant to the Minister of Agriculture and Land Reclamation for International Collaboration. Since 2007, Dr. El Atribi has been the president of the National Gene Bank, or NGB, in Egypt, which is affiliated with the Agricultural Research Center, or ARC, with all the acronyms here, with the Ministry of Agriculture and Land Reclamation. The mandate of the National Gene Bank is the collection, conservation, characterization, documentation, and utilization of genetic resources for food and agriculture. In her capacity as head of NGB, she has been named the focal point for the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization's Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture and the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. Prior to that, she served as the president of the Agricultural Research Center from 2006 to 2007. And before that, she was the director of Genetic Engineering Research Institute, in addition to being the deputy president of the ARC for Research. So please welcome Dr. El Atribi. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. So we're going to start off. Well, first of all, I've told the panelists this, but I encourage everyone to discuss amongst each other. If you have anything you'd like to say to another panelist, an agreement, an objection, any comment, please just grab your microphone and start talking. So to start with, as mentioned earlier today in our workshop, there are several major threats to biodiversity: deforestation, pollution, fragmentation, and climate change. And to that, we also added invasive species. So Dr. Bieber-Fraudenberger, to build on Dr. Pashka Palmer's introductory remarks, I'll start off with a pretty big question. Can you give us a brief idea of how climate change affects biodiversity?
Well, biodiversity and how it's being distributed all over the world depends very much on climate. And so climate is very vital where we find, for example, certain species and where we don't find it. So climate change is impacting the distribution of species, it's impacting how they are behaving, and by that it's also impacting how species behave to each other, for example. This morning I brought the example of pollinators and how the flowering of flowering periods and the pollination's active period are being decoupled by climate change, which of course then also leads to shifts in whole ecosystems if certain plants are not there anymore. And this impacts also ecosystem services we are deriving from these systems. In the case of pollinators, this would mean that we are having a massive loss, an economic loss, because we are losing the services that are being provided in terms of pollination, which is about 3/4 of our food crops being directly dependent on animal pollination. So, yeah.
Thank you for that brief but thorough explanation. Now to jump straight into the meat of things and get to policy. The UN CBD COP 2 years ago in Mexico focused on agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and tourism. The upcoming COP in Egypt will target issues relating to energy, mining, infrastructure, manufacturing, and processing, as well as health. So Dr. Zidane, as Egypt's national focus point for the COP14, can you tell us what's in the works now, what Egypt's planning to put forward for COP14 to protect biodiversity?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. In fact, Egypt, in collaboration with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, will have to work on the program for COP14. And as you rightly said, the theme of the high-level segment of COP14 focuses on the mainstream of biological diversity in the sectors, particularly energy, the mining, the health, industry, and infrastructure. And in fact, during the discussion that we held a couple of days ago with the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity and our colleagues, we talked about, or she is the one, in fact, that she said that, well, you are here in Africa, and even if the conference of the parties decided that this will be the issue that will be tackled. So, but here, in fact, you should look at the issue of the ecosystem restoration, and because this is affecting particularly countries in the arid and semi-arid area and suffering from desertification, particularly African countries and the Middle Eastern countries. And so this, in fact, we were thinking and we proposed to have an African biodiversity summit for the African ministers, focusing on biological diversity and the issues of biological diversity of relevance to the continent, to Africa continent. And we thought that this will be the strong message that will be coming out of COP14 regarding the ecosystem restoration and its importance, particularly with regard to climate change. And as she rightly said, in fact, climate change will not affect all the species equally, but all the species are living in balance in the ecosystem. If one of them is affected, this will disturb the balance. So this is why climate change, we don't expect that, or we cannot say that will affect every species equally, even if it affects only one species. And there was a very nice thing written in the museum in Wadi al-Hitan that we saw this morning, saying change or die, that you have to do it or lose it. Yeah. So if you don't adapt, if you don't mitigate, so certainly to climate change. And as she rightly said, Dr. Palmer, that in fact biological diversity will be the main thing that could be used in the adaptation to climate change. It will play the major role in adaptation to climate change.
So to get to this issue that you were talking about of ecosystem restoration, can you maybe give us a couple examples of some things that you would like to see changed or pushed through to help ecosystem restoration?
In Egypt, for example, we have many ecosystems that are very fragile, such as the marine ecosystems, our marine ecosystems. Our ecosystems in desert ecosystems, they're fragile, and certainly we lost even in agriculture, we lost a lot of our arable land. So we have to look at all these together, you know.
So let me extend the same question to you, Noor. As somebody as an environmentalist working in civil society, what kind of concrete measures would you like to see to help ecosystem restoration?
There are plenty of measures, to be very honest. It would be very difficult to pinpoint one, and I think the reason why we're hosting the COP next year is because there's a lot that needs to be discussed, there's a lot that needs to be achieved, but I think it really needs to start, and very honestly speaking, on a public policy level. At the moment, Egypt has had a difficult few years, and therefore trying to discuss, I don't want to say new concepts like biodiversity, because the Egyptians for thousands of years considered their biodiversity as sacred. So this is not a new thought, but it has not been a priority for a while, meaning that in the past few years, it's been difficult to push for biodiversity protection, conservation, restoration. So essentially, the first thing that needs to start is a genuine intent to be expressed for the conservation of biodiversity, for the conservation of nature. Declarations are useful, and signing conventions is also useful. However, once we start responding to this as an emergency, because it is an emergency, only then can we start seeing true actions.
Okay, let me open the same question to the panel. I mean, are there any concrete, any measures you would like to see going forward for the COP14? Is there any wish list that you would have?
I might talk about. I'll try.
Okay, go ahead. Okay.
Considering agrobiodiversity, we hope that we have our law out by then, which makes it easier to implement the treaty, both treaties, as I mentioned. I think the CBD is on its way in the Parliament. I'm talking about the treaty for International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture.
Oh, can you give us a little background to this treaty for the people that might not know it?
Okay. The treaty is with the FAO, and it's really focuses on food and agriculture, genetic resources, and because it has a special, it's special because for independence, most of the countries have got their genetic or their crops from other countries. And we look at climate change, it will make the interdependence more, it will increase, okay? So here it sort of gets together, makes it easier to access genetic resources, and at the same time taking in consideration the equitable benefit sharing of its utilization. So we have what we call a multilateral system, which the treaty plays as a third beneficiary, because it was based upon the request of the developing countries that they needed a mechanism to ensure that they will be getting in funding or whatever support to the use of their genetic resources. So it's a little bit different from the CBD, but I think it will work. The funds are used for capacity building. They're used to fund projects, for also to be able to implement the projects there, and for gene banks to be there. And we are looking also for in situ and on-farm conservation. We have to take another look at that, because ex situ conservation is not the only solution. Rather, if you have these on-farm and in situ, it evolves, the genetic resources evolve with the stress conditions.
Ah, yes. So I'm definitely going to start asking you questions about bioagricultural diversity in a little bit, because this is a really interesting topic. But to bring it back to sort of the big picture, in the planning stages. So I have this question for Dr. Zidane, but I would like to extend it for everybody here on the panel too. With the increase in agricultural production, industry, and tourism, how do you find a compromise between economic development and biodiversity? You know, for example, do you see sort of site-specific, smaller-scale strategies as the way forward, or these big picture initiatives and goals? How do you balance that?
Well, I want to say a few things before I answer this question, just to remind ourselves of something. I was lucky, in fact, to be involved in the negotiation of the Convention on Biological Diversity when it started in mid-80s and continued through until 1992. And I must say, when they started to talk about biodiversity, climate change, and very little talk regarding desertification or land degradation. And at this time, it was very difficult for everybody to understand what this biological diversity, what does it mean? And this is one, and still is a problem. Because when you say climate change, everybody knows, oh, it is getting hot, it is getting cold, you know, we have waves of heat, we have this, we have that, so the people, it's very simple to understand. But when you say biological diversity, then it is difficult. And until this moment, it is difficult. So we have to find ways and means to convey this message to the public. And even during the negotiation, in fact, before starting the negotiation, they were saying, but what is this biological diversity? And they asked a question to all the UN countries, member states. Do you know what do you have in terms of biological diversity? And the answer from all UN states, no. They do not. They don't know. And they said, okay, fine. Then before doing anything, want to know what do we have in terms of biological diversity. So they selected 10 countries, and one of them was Egypt. One of the 10 countries that asked them to prepare a country study on national biological diversity, or national biological diversity. And they prepared, of course, they used some guidelines that were established for them, etc. And notice that the title of the convention is Convention on Biological Diversity, because they refused to say the Convention for Conservation of Biological Diversity. Because this is always the people, they forget that they said, no, it is not only a convention for biological diversity. Biological diversity cannot be put in a museum. If we don't use it, we will lose it. And as such, the convention, it's a three objective: conservation, utilization, and access and benefit sharing. You have to conserve, and you have to utilize components of the biological diversity, and then you share the benefits arising from the utilization of these components, particularly the genetic resources. So when I hear some people that, oh, conservation means that protected areas don't touch anything, this cannot be understood. We have to be very careful. We have to be very careful that protected areas are not museums. They are not museums. Particularly these days, and with these advances in molecular biology, etc., I don't need many of, I must say very frankly, you know, all what I want to know is to know the genetic makeup of the plant or the animal or the microorganism, and then I may not need it at all, because I can do some of these things in the laboratory, and this is happening. It is happening now. And we have to be extremely careful. Then, this is 25 years ago, because in December next year, it will be the 25th anniversary of the Convention on Biological Diversity.
Dr. Stan, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
What do you see then as the role of protected areas? How do you envision them
Protected
working?
areas are very important, but we should not establish protected areas unless we have some sort of defining exactly whether we need it or not. We have to know what are we protecting. And this should be based on science, not in anything. In the past, the United Nations used to just use the diplomats. They go to the meetings, and they talk, and they decide, and that is the decision. Now it is not anymore. All UN decisions are based on science.
Okay, so I have a quick question now to ask for Noor to open this up, and also to everyone in the panel. With protected areas, I mean, what do you see? Noor works for an NGO that deals, one of their current projects is about protecting migratory birds from wind turbines. So protected areas are presumably an issue here. How do you see the role of protected areas in Egypt?
Dr. Hamdallah raises an excellent point, which is science is necessary to take decisions. Protected areas aren't museums. Protected areas are a management system. It's a way for us to better manage a natural resource that we have. Science can sometimes dictate that we can use some of these natural resources in a certain area, and sometimes science can dictate that we need to keep this as protected as possible because it is being impacted by climate change and could be further fueling the impacts of climate change. So these are management systems and in my opinion, at the moment in Egypt are critical because we do have vast amounts of space that are declared as protected area. However, the necessary follow-up with the science, the research, the follow-up, as well as the enforcement is very difficult. You notice that in Egypt, some of the most beautiful protected areas that are homes to some of the brilliant scientists in Egypt that spend their lives in these natural habitats, and they want or they need more resources to conduct the science and to be able to enforce the law and help with the management. So the number one priority really for protected areas or any other area that's being managed is for there to be a state-sponsored support of lots of these young men and women working at the Egyptian Environmental Affairs Agency to help them really do what they can do best.
Okay, so to open this up again for this issue of policy and support, one of the focuses on the COP14 that we discussed is mitigating biodiversity losses from industry, mining, infrastructure, things like this. So Dr. Al-Tribi, Dr. Zidane, what are the current policies in place to protect biodiversity from large-scale agricultural or development projects? You know, for example, is biodiversity, is this taken into account or is this part of mandatory environmental impact studies, for example? How are we conceiving of protecting biodiversity for agriculture and large-scale development? What's in place now?
And in fact, for any project with agriculture or industrial or mining or whatever, we have to start by environmental impact assessment. Unless we do this, then we cannot say that, okay, don't do this or don't do that. We must know exactly what is the situation. And one of the things that I hope COP14 will do is to just look and see, assess what has been achieved in terms of biological diversity. How much did the convention achieve in the 25 years and how much is left? It has had to be a scientific, technical, and a very frank assessment that a convention, they have these work programs. Let us see what has been achieved and what has not been achieved and why. What went right and what went wrong. And then, based on this, they can decide on the new strategy. You know?
Okay, so but specifically, what current policies are in place now to account for biological diversity when planning agricultural and industrial projects? Like, what do we have in place now? Would either of you like to comment?
I think Dr. Hani, can.
Yes, of course. Okay. Oh, and sorry, before you give your answer, wait 1 second. Everybody make sure you write your questions down on the piece of paper because our colleagues will come around to collect the questions in a couple minutes. This is your reminder. All right. Sorry, thank you.
We mentioned one of the reasons for the losses of agrobiodiversity or crop diversity. I should say maybe I'm putting more emphasis on crops rather than all the agro. With the monocultures or just having one or two varieties across Egypt, now there is a different look at it. Now we're having several varieties. It's not really related to genetic diversity, but it is part of it. So you have in the different regions, ecosystem regions in Egypt, you have different varieties that are they do well in these places, okay? So even if we have a stress condition, then you do have some, you get some harvest rather than it's all wiped up. And then we have we want awareness, more awareness for the farmers that they look after the genetic resources. We have been able to conduct some surveys, and there are still some farmers that prefer their own germplasm that they have inherited through the years from their grandfathers and so on, because they find that they prefer it than the other one. Also, we do have the field days, and we do have participatory plant breeding, where we invite farmers to look at, in the field days, to look at the different varieties, new varieties, and they choose them. And also with the gene bank, we have the accessions that we have collected, and we have it out in the fields, in experimental fields, in different locations, and we invite the farmers. And we ask them, why do you like this certain fact? So we do get feedback here, and here we have the community taking, they feel that is they own, or they have an active part in designing these things.
Okay.
So I don't know if I got the right answer to you.
Sorry, would you like to add something?
Yes, I mean, I can't talk too much about the Egyptian case because I'm not so familiar with the Egyptian environmental law, but I think in most countries we actually have now environmental impact assessments in place, at least legally, that when there is some kind of big infrastructure being planned, that there has to be an environmental impact assessment. Now, as I said, I can't talk about Egypt in this specific case, but I know about many other countries that there's actually the problem that even if you have the law, that doesn't mean that what's happening on the ground is actually what was intended by the law. So in many cases, we don't actually have the biodiversity data to do a proper environmental impact assessment. So that's one problem. And in many other cases, we have also the problem that, and again, I'm not talking about Egypt here, but generally in some countries, projects are being granted the environmental license because the environmental impacts are being kind of played down or just kind of not being really acknowledged in the assessments. So having the law is one thing, but then the proper implementation is often a completely different thing, and I think this has to be acknowledged. Yes.
Well, this is a good point. And earlier in the workshop, when Noor was discussing the project with protecting migratory birds from wind turbines, you found that environmental impact assessments for wind power plants had something to do with biodiversity. So can you comment on that?
Sure. So just a quick clarification. Under the Egyptian Law of Environment, Law 4 of 1994, it stipulates that any project does require an environmental impact assessment, and there's a specific sector within the Egyptian Environmental Affairs Agency that specializes with these environmental impact assessments. So there's a strong institution that is present in order to follow up with these EIAs, which is the acronym for Environmental Impact Assessment. The issue, though, especially when it comes to biodiversity, is that there isn't a standardized set of rules and regulations relating to the different components of biodiversity, which we found very apparent during wind farm projects. So just to give you quick context, Egypt's Red Sea coast is located in one of the windiest areas in the world, which gives it very high potential for renewable wind energy. This has a huge priority because this is what we're all striving for the sake of sustainability. However, and coincidentally, This exact same place lies at the heart of the second most important migratory route for soaring birds around the world. We're talking about eagles, storks, pelicans. So in those specific locations where the wind farms were being planned, millions of birds are crossing through the exact same place at potential altitudes that could lead to a biological disaster. And what followed up from there was an excellent cooperation through the Migratory Soaring Birds Project, which is a GEF UNDP project managed by BirdLife International and implemented here in Egypt through the Egyptian Environmental Affairs Agency in collaboration with our organization, Nature Conservation Egypt. Sorry for that entire process, but it's just to show that there's a collaboration between governmental organizations, civil society, and international organizations to prepare for or to support different sectors, including the energy sector, so that they can plan and integrate biodiversity and nature into their policies. What does this mean? It means that now, if you want to set up a wind energy project in this location, you need to follow, to produce a specific set of an environmental impact assessment that is standardized. So you can figure out exactly how many birds are passing through this place, what is its sensitivity to birds and biodiversity as a whole. And this is actually a huge step forward in light of Egypt and planning for wind energy.
No, it does sound like an amazing step forward for policy. And Dr. Fouad has been very kind to offer to add some more comments on the policy section.
Thank you, and I apologize, I'm not part of the panel, but maybe to respond to the part related to the policy, I totally agree with what Noor has mentioned here related to the projects, but let me give you here what do we mean by this. The policy, without being implemented, it will still be on the shelf. So what the Egyptian Environmental Affairs Agency was trying to do, and that was several years ago, is to try to provide evidence-based policy. What do we mean by this? There is alternative. If we want to conserve the natural resources, to ensure that biodiversity is being maintained, then we have to give alternative to the community. This is exactly what we have been doing in a very successful case study for the medicinal plants in St. Catherine, where the community used to take out those plants in order to make it as a source for energy. So we need to find a way in order for those communities to stop doing this. The only way we do this is the core for sustainable development, is to let them and to show them that those medicinal plants need to be conserved, yet they can sell that in an outlet. It will provide a kind of a job opportunity. It will enhance the social standard as well as they are conserve the natural resources. With that typical example of the medicinal plant, I would say that that's the replica when you try to find a solution to the biodiversity. The poor people there, the local community, need to have their traditional knowledge, and you need to be able not really to tell them, stop wasting the natural resources and consider the biological diversity, because as Professor Dr. Hamdallah has mentioned, that would be very difficult for them to understand. The only way is that we, as regulators, as part of the government, we need to adapt to them. And we need to give them alternative. The final thing that I would like to mention here, that yes, biodiversity was not given that very much attention at the national level, but as I mentioned, within the Sustainable Development Strategy, we're trying to bridge the gap between the international commitments and the national policies and program as part of this strategy, because they should not be two paths. It's only a one path where we have commitments and we're translating that into action. And now we have the biosafety and the access and benefit sharing. Both those are being submitted to the Parliament, so that we are trying to translate more those commitments into national laws. And when we are enforcing this, we are giving alternatives. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. That's a really good example that you brought up that highlights many of these points. So one thing that was brought up a little bit earlier is this issue of data and information. So one of Egypt's goals, according to its 2015-2030 National Biodiversity Strategies Action Plan, is to have large databases with biodiversity information and to connect diverse research sectors through open source data. And this would be something that would be very informative for making environmental impact analysis and all these sorts of things. Can you comment on the importance of data in biodiversity and conservation?
Yes. Well, I mean, data are the basis for research. We need to collect data and to do our research, but there have been numerous projects all around the world collecting data and not, storing them properly, or just storing them on one computer, or maybe even on a server, but from a small project that is then not being maintained in the future. So we have a lot of knowledge. We also have a lot of knowledge, for example, in our natural history museums, also where species are being distributed, but they are not digitalized. But to bring this knowledge together in digital databases and make it accessible for researchers is very important because, well, it's, as I said, the basis of research, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over again. So we should take what we already have, put this all together, and work from there and fill the gaps that we still have. Yeah.
So for Egypt, how close are we to getting some sort of database with some open access? And if we are not close, what are some of the major challenges or obstacles?
There's a foundation of data in Egypt, and this data has been acquired over several different decades. The issue is sometimes someone like me would have to quickly Google something to find an answer for something that he needs, and the last reference that you have is something in the late 80s or early 90s. So we do still have an issue with data and research simply because it is not a matter of public policy to invest in science and to invest in research. And this is, I think, one of the main issues that we do have in Egypt as a whole right now. And this is manifesting in lots of different educational issues as well as technical and the issues such as the ones that we're dealing with now. Another issue at hand is also the role of civil society. Civil society around the world plays a very important scientific role, and there's a huge issue with civil society in Egypt at the moment, whereas the laws do not really allow NGOs to function the way they could elsewhere, which really inhibits the ability to perform proper science and to reduce and alleviate pressures from the government to conduct these. So these are some issues that we need to address.
Thank you. I think that, does anybody have a comment for that?
Yes. I think we have a lot of data, but still the scientific community and the civil society are not integrated in the day-to-day management of the whole thing. The policymakers are on one side, the scientists are on the other side, civil society, again, having their own agenda, but there are a lot of data, but these data are not yet collected, properly managed, and in some areas like botany, for example, they have a lot of data in Egypt. In some areas, very, very scarce, the data is very scarce. And I don't think that until this moment, the practitioners are using this data or applying them. So this is what has been or should be done.
No, I mean,
yes, yes, we need data, yes, in order to take.
Yes. I mean, are there any
decisions,
policy steps moving forward that would help achieve this?
I think that in all projects that will be supporting the whole issue of biological diversity, there should be some component on research and development, and how to use or to harness the results for the better conservation of biological resources. Because we have go and you have many, and in fact there are even some databases, but nobody is using it. And it is the problem is that everything is based on individual interests. So I'm interested in this, I'm doing it. Once I retire or leave, so the whole thing will disappear. This is a real problem here in Egypt. One issue also, the enforcement. The enforcement is a big issue. We have very nice pieces of law, but they are not enforced.
This is okay. There's an audience question about this, and I'll
they're
ask
not
you in a
enforced.
second.
So what? I have very, very good law, but nobody is enforcing it. And you can see this on how much of the agricultural land disappeared. And just go around Cairo and see all this, what is it? Buildings, oh my God, what is this? All these red bricks in a couple of years, they just, so we are using the agricultural land and then we go to the desert to reclaim it. This cannot be imagined.
So Dr. Al-Trabi has a comment to make on this.
I'd just like to mention that in one of the articles in the treaty, the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources, is on global information system. And we are having a workshop with the Treaty Secretariat next week for the Near East, NENA region, Near East and North Africa, and it is for capacity building and how to put all the information on characterization, molecular characterization, and whatever information that has come out from the work on the studies on genetic diversity in the crop plants, actually, and have it out there for the whole global community to have access to. So here it will help with the utilization.
Yes, it would.
And it will, this is it's already there. We have Genesis, and there's the Green Global, and there are networks where you need to put this information out there. Mm-hmm. And as mentioned by Dr. Zidane, people are reluctant to put the information in. So, but we are trying to
move towards it. Okay, so now I'll turn towards the audience questions. There's several about protected areas. That seems to be a big interest. So this is a question that sums up several questions here. How can we resist investor, I suppose that means business or investor pressure on the government so that we can have real protection of nature, especially in protected areas? So this is about enforcement. How can we resist pressure and enforce protected areas? I'll open this up to anybody on the panel who wants to answer.
I don't like saying that we have to resist investors. No, we should not resist investment. But any investor that he wants to do something, this will have to be assessed very carefully. And we just weigh the pros and cons and a decision to be taken. If it is something that is affecting, for example, mining, and the area is a hotspot for biological diversity, certainly we should say no. But this should be based on scientific and solid data, not on individual interests, not on pressure from the civil society, but based on scientific and technical basis. Because I can see sometimes in some countries, once the civil society or NGO, they go out crying for this, for that, they immediately stop. No, you can talk to them, and I'm very sure that they will listen. They will listen to this. And again, sometimes the government wants to do it, and although there is every evidence that this is bad for biological diversity, but still, they want to do it. So we have to base everything on environmental impact assessments using the best science that is available, and the data are available before saying yes or no. But I cannot say to all investors, no, I don't want this, no, I don't want that, because this will not work.
Do we have any comments?
It is exactly like if you are going to prevent the local communities from using biological diversity, they will not listen to you. They want to eat. They want to use the medicinal plants for their treatment. So when you tell them, they will just ignore you, but come with alternative solutions. As she says, you have to tell them, no, don't do this because of such and such, but you can do it another way, or you can, this is another alternative, etc.
maybe I can comment on it. I think your question was also about in protected areas, in particularly. So I think it's very important that if we have protected areas, that they are being protected because they are there for some reason. That doesn't mean that there can't be human activity in there in a certain restricted way. But I think this should also especially be beneficial to the local communities living in those protected areas and close by, and not so much to companies, maybe even foreign companies coming into countries, especially now in Africa.
Just to take that point a little bit further, and I think Dr. Hamdallah made an interesting distinction at the end with regards to local communities. You can't go to a local community member and tell them you can't do this and you can't do this. But sadly, in what we've seen a lot, what happens is that it's the local community investors, if we call them that, they usually don't have that much of a voice because they usually don't have that much money in their bank accounts. And let's be very honest, sadly we still live in a time and place where money is influence, and therefore when we talk about investment, we are not against investments in protected areas, because by protecting an area, that in itself is an investment. The issue is with larger investors who are not necessarily related to that community, and the main goals in the end are profit driven. And you see thankfully there aren't that many examples in current protected areas because there's still a system to keep that away. However, the main point that we should go to is that we should promote local investment, so local communities become economically and personally invested in these places for there to actually be conservation.
Thank you. That's a very nuanced understanding. So we have a question for Dr. Tribi. What's Egypt's status in breeding stress for strategic crops tolerant to drought, salinity, and high temperatures? So I think this relates to a bigger issue on what are the current threats to Egypt's agricultural biodiversity. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, you can take it.
For plant breeding, there are the programs at the Agricultural Research Center, which I'm aware of, is they are trying to develop, or they're developing low input new varieties, which for water conservation, they need less water. They are tolerant to drought, tolerant to heat, tolerant to diseases. So this is already in the strategy for the Agricultural Research Center. As I said, we are evaluating the genetic resources that we have already collected under these conditions to be able to, and we work with the breeders. We always work with the breeders. So they are the ones who select what they find interesting, and they use it in their breeding programs.
Okay.
Okay, so I don't know if
I hope you answered somebody's question out there. So looking towards the future, how can biodiversity resources be used to mitigate and adapt to climate change? So I want to ask this question on a more theoretical level, maybe in a general way for Dr. Bieber Freudenberger, and then maybe for our three other panelists, maybe specifically to Egypt.
Yeah. So biodiversity or ecosystems have this great ability to actually change if there are changing conditions. So, but this is only the case if they are still functional. So if they are rich in species, so they can actually change to whatever comes at them, right? So I think one way of being able to adapt to future climate change is by actually protecting those very functional and resilient ecosystems. And this also, I think, already goes a long way in terms of mitigation, because in many cases, these will be ecosystems that are already storing a lot of carbon, and that they will also store a lot of carbon in the future. So I think we have to really make these climate smart conservation decisions. We have to really try to find the win-win situations where we can do something for climate change by protecting, for example, areas, and where we can do something for biodiversity conservation, because this goes hand in hand, and we shouldn't make this distinction all the time.
If I can maybe give two practical examples so that we can really try to envision how biodiversity can be used to mitigate or manage the impacts of climate change. We'll start off, for example, by talking about mangroves. So the mangrove trees that are found on the coasts of the Red Sea, they're located in specific areas in which floods, when it does rain that time of year in Egypt, the floods, they find their way down to the coast, bringing nutrients from the mountains to the mangroves, and also the mangroves then protect the coral reefs from the flooding that is coming from the mountains. At the same time, the mangroves help hold the ground together, which protects the ground habitats from coastal erosion from the sea. So mangroves in themselves, by protecting mangrove ecosystems and investing in these ecosystems, you'd be helping the coral reefs manage the climate change impacts that they'll be enduring, and you'll be helping an ecosystem as a whole. So that's one example of how you can invest. Another example, and on a very different front, is bird watching tourism. Egypt lies at the heart of one of the most important migratory routes. Millions of birds, they pass by Egypt. By promoting this type of alternative, environmentally responsible and conscious tourism, you could reduce the impacts of mass tourism, and therefore reduce the impacts on the local environment, support the protection of the local environment, and that way you'd be using, but indirectly, biodiversity to mitigate the actions of climate change. So there's, it's not specific solutions, it's a mindset, and it's a mindset that we really need to start adopting because it is an emergency.
Okay, so this is more towards one of the earlier questions I asked about kind of small-scale, site-specific plans for biodiversity versus the big picture large policy.
It has to go both ways, to be honest, because the big picture policy, it forces those responsible for implementation on the ground, it forces them to act. And when those on the ground, the small scale projects, when they are implemented and people see that they could work, then there's hope for it, rather than us envisioning theoretical scenarios that are never achieved.
So this is the final question. It's from the audience, and I quite like this. How do you advise, this is for the entire panel, everyone can jump in, every person in society to contribute to conserving biodiversity? What can we all do, I think is this person's question. It's an interesting way to end it. Let's see what you guys have to say. Yes. Oh, sorry, we have one more question. Oh, at the end, okay.
Yeah, maybe I just start. I think there are so many ways how everyone can actually do something to save biodiversity. I think it starts actually with our children. So we can teach our children that we have to value our nature and to also engage them in nature somehow, to go with them out there and to understand why we need this biodiversity out there. We can save resources in all kinds of instances. We can take the bike or walk instead of taking the car. Or we can eat less meat, for example. So we need less resources to feed the animals we're eating then in the end. And I think there are so many different ways, and I think it's very personal how everyone decides to contribute. I think it's just important that everyone decides to contribute something.
Thank you. Anyone? No? Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes, everyone wants. Sorry.
Well, I agree with you entirely. In fact, it has to start from the early childhood. And there are very simple examples, because we have to teach our children that, okay, you are eating these tomatoes or this bread, etc. This comes from plants. You're eating this food, or meat, this comes from animals. You are drinking this milk. Even I just can't imagine if the services, for example, the microorganisms they play very important role in decomposing the corpuses. Just imagine that all the bodies of animals and humans and the plants are not decomposed, and see how much will accumulate. And we have very small microorganisms, they do it for us free of charge. Just imagine that the whole issue of the oxygen that we breathe. If oxygen is not produced because we destroy all these plants, etc., etc. But most of these services are guaranteed and free of charge. And this is why biological diversity is disappearing. So if we start with our children teaching this to them at schools, and in fact, the Ministry of the Environment, they are trying to inject some things in the curricula, but this needs a very strong commitment.
That's a really good point. Noor?
Please forgive me if I take this philosophical tangent, but really to answer your question, if there's one thing that can be done, it's dismantling a culture, and to be very specific, dismantling a culture of consumerism, where we're constantly consuming. We're not just talking about this country. We're talking about it's a global political and economic system that thrives on us consuming more and more, and those that can provide us more to consume are those that gain the most profits. And therefore, dismantling this culture is actually at the start of realizing that we are biodiversity. We've spent the entire day today discussing biodiversity, and sometimes we forget that we are biodiversity. And therefore, by dismantling this culture, we get to remember this more. I personally think that, yes, we should invest in our children, but we should also invest in our inner child that gets a little bit, that should be scared because things aren't okay. And if we're going to invest in the children, we should invest in our inner children as well.
That's a really good point. Your Excellency, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. Just to follow up, because I like very much the emphasis that Dr. Fouad and also Noor and others made on the question of mindset, dismantling a culture. We need a revolutionary change, and that revolutionary change has to start in a way in our mind and in our behavior. You were talking about alternative economic models. The local community have to benefit. Otherwise, if they don't have ownership in the long run, this is not going to last. So a lot of these ideas are in a way the fundament of what's called the green economy, which is another concept that emerged 20 years after Rio and after our convention was created. And green economy talks about this sort of transformation of the economic model, transformation of the way we produce, transformation of the way we measure our development, because we measure it through the GDP growth. We don't measure it through the qualitative and the distribution of this wealth. So I was wondering, Noor and the others, what do you think about this sort of green economy transformation, green economy framework for Egypt, and as applies maybe to CBD? Could this be the general framework under which we discuss these linkages between biodiversity, nature, development, local community, eco-entrepreneurship, creating those businesses and investors from the local community, not a foreign investor coming to build an ecotourist lodge, but maybe helping the community develop that lodge. I'm interested in hearing that also because in the beginning we discussed, what should be the main focal point of the high-level segment. So it would be good to hear your thoughts as Egyptians on it. Thank you.
That's a good question. Thank you. Okay, why don't we do the general with Dr. Okay. You can start.
Okay, I think greening the economy is very important, but we should not forget local communities, because everywhere they are marginalized, and they are the beneficiaries, and also they are big consumers. I'm not saying that they consume in a non-sustainable way, because they have very little to consume, I must say as well. But how to involve them in greening of the economy, not only at the Ministry of Planning and the Ministry of Economy and the Ministry of the Environment, and these very nice pieces of strategies that I don't know whether it will be resolving the problems or not, but how to involve the marginalized the local communities, because I'm talking about Egypt. Mainly we are agricultural country. We cannot forget this. And most of the people are in the countryside, and most of them are marginalized. So when you talk about green economy, involve these people.
Yeah, I completely agree with this. I think it depends very much how you frame green economy. So if you talk about green economy in terms of bioeconomy, so an economy that is shifting away from fossil-based economy towards biomass-based economy, basically, I think that can't be the solution. Or at least not the only solution. Because the problem is if we are just using the same amount of energy, but we're not using fossil energy anymore, but we are using biomass instead, our problems will actually increase. If we are talking, however, about finding or maybe growing food in our own garden, having small-scale businesses that are really well interested in producing really sustainably, then I think this can be do a long way towards actually achieving also global sustainability. Yes.
I think an essential component of green economy is the ability to be able to sustain oneself. So a small community would be able to sustain itself with its most basic requirements, or at least a country as a whole would be able to sustain itself. At the moment, we're in a sadly shameful phase of our history where we are importing most of our essential foods, which is catastrophic because we have the magical Nile River. And what this in itself entails is that if we're importing that much and there is an industry for import and export that profits from importing such things, it means that the entire system is currently framed against a green economy, to the extent that every time I think or hear the words green economy, I see a textbook sitting on a desk, and it's hard to imagine it because it is so far from the current way that things are going. So essentially what is really necessary is a top-down approach if we're talking about green economy, but until that happens, things also have to, just for the sake of survival, from bottom up.
All right, thank you very much, panelists, for your insightful comments. I'd also like to thank Dr. Fouad. You did a wonderful job talking about a local initiative. You are part of the panel now? Well, thank you so much. It was very appreciated. And Dr. Peshka-Palmer, thank you so much for your question. That was an excellent question. And most importantly of all, thank you all for attending. There's a reception in the garden right now, so if you would all join us for some food and some refreshments, we would all be happy to talk to you out there. Thank you very much.